So some litigation tips that, first of all, that apply to all parties. Gordon mentioned this, asking the right questions. I think we need to build into our document collection worksheets and our IT question interviews, social media. That's probably obvious for people in the room, but you need to ask, what does the company allow? And then you need to ask what actually happens, because those two things are different. That's why I had trust but verify on the second line. You need to have your team look at what's out there publicly, and you need to have some heart-to-heart conversations with the custodians to really get into these areas. Whether they use IMs or their home email, and now social media to do business. I would consider seriously referencing it expressly on your preservation plan that you put together, referencing it on your litigation hold, and the way you define electronic communications. And obviously, as I just said, mentioning it on your collection checklist as you go through and interview each custodian. Documenting all steps, you heard about that earlier. And I already mentioned this concept of, it's always hard. Do you expressly bring it up with the other side? The courts are now expecting lawyers to disclose more than they ever have before, to exchange search parameters and search terms, and it's really kind of uncomfortable because you're in this litigation situation and you don't want to turn over the keys to the castle. But I think the trend now is more disclosure because frankly it will protect you down the road if you can tell the court that the other side knew about this. Or you can be more crafty in how you draft your stipulations and your letter agreements on how discovery is going to go. So these are things you need to think about. If you're the requesting party, look for that hook on the public information and then try to narrowly tailor your requests. If you think that there's a custodian or a group of custodians that have relevant social media information, then target it in a specific way, and that will obviously make it more likely that it will be produced. If you're the responding party, hopefully by this time you'll have already known what your company policy is, but if, as Gordon said, you have a policy in place, you can use that as a defense. Your Honor, we have a policy that says you cannot use it for business purposes. You cannot use social media outward. We actually asked the custodians whether they used it, and they all confirmed that they do not. That's pretty good evidence that you did a reasonable and good faith approach. But obviously you need to think about these things not after they file a motion to compel, but earlier on in the case. Investigate real world. This is where you cross-check what is actually happening. And then the decision, we often face in these things is, do you want to fight it and potentially raise red flags and shine a spotlight on it? Or do you just comply and say, okay, we'll look for social media, and you go do your reasonable, good faith approach, and maybe you find nothing. Or you find a couple things you're not worried about. And that's always a difficult decision, and you have to think strategically about how savvy the other side is. And it always comes down to, what are this mutual assured destruction. The last one is return the favor. If there is a corporate plaintiff against a corporate defendant client of mine, and they are starting to stick their nose in these kind of weird, cutting edge areas, then they are going to get back the same requests and then some. So, and maybe that's a discussion you actually have to have with opposing counsel and talk it through and say, listen, do you really want to go down this road? You may be entitled to it, but just know that we're going to open up, a whole new litigation within the litigation. So those are some of the tips. Again, public information is okay. You start to get into the caution area when you're interacting with unrepresented or third parties. There's a general consensus that when you deal with a third party, there's actually rules. You have to disclose your right name and your identity. There is a difference, though, between certain districts and bars as to whether or not you need to disclose the motive for your communication. So you go up to somebody in a bar that you know is a third-party witness. You can say, hi, I'm Brian Rocca. I'm a lawyer in town. I work for Bingham McCutcheon. How you doing? And then you start the small talk to try to get the information. In some places, that's actually okay as long as you disclose who you're associated with. But I think in Philadelphia, the bar there says you have to disclose the motive for sitting there. You've got to say, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about this lawsuit. I'm involved in the lawsuit. I know you might be as well. And so the same thing would apply for social media. You can't create situations and lie to somebody. That's the red light at the bottom. But you might be able to facilitate communication with a third party over these means. But you have to think carefully before you send off the first-year associate to do it without giving guidance, because there are people at the firm that you work at that will be very good at these things, that know how to run in these circles, and they might not know what the rules are, and people can get in big trouble.
We're going to talk a little bit about pre-litigation and post-litigation collection, and Brian and Gordon both touched on it earlier. One example that Brian gave was jury research, right? You're really going out and doing all your research. It's really just to use to try to help select a jury or try to help go after a witness or an adverse party. Not necessarily concerned about the whole evidentiary value and how you're going to introduce it under the Dobbs-Frye standard, etc., right? You're just doing the research. That could be considered kind of a pre-litigation preparation. Then you have maybe post-litigation or in anticipation of litigation. You want to do some social media research for evidentiary purposes that you may be able to introduce. So moving to the next slide, if you make a comparison of social media when you compare it to traditional discovery versus social discovery, it's really traditional discovery. You search, identify, preserve, analyze, and produce, right? Steve, one click, please. Again, same thing, really. It's just how do you go about it from various social media sites. Now, the purpose of this slide here is for, do any of you here do just research for your firms or anything for, maybe not necessarily for litigation purposes, but just for researching individuals? Nobody? Okay, let's throw this slide in the trash. No, I'm just kidding. You can take it anyways. If you ever want to do research, here's some interesting websites that you can go to help assist you in your research, and we'll kind of go through some of these. The first one is called pq.com, and this one here really kind of gives you the option of entering a name, or I think Brian was the one that mentioned earlier, a screen name. And so next slide. Here's where you start beginning your research on individuals. I plug in a name, Neil Lawson, and I start, getting. And this is true research. This isn't something I concocted just for this presentation. This is real stuff that I've done. And I see here, okay, there's 8 different hits. And so just as an example, the first one was a LinkedIn. And so part of my research, I clicked on that, and it took me to this external site redirect, which of course is LinkedIn. Here's where you can start seeing what people are posting on their LinkedIn and available for public view. In this case, it's some clown that works at eDiscovery Solutions. Oh wait, that's why I work. And so then we kind of move on with our research. So on the next slide, Steve, if it's in here, from there I start researching other internet hits that I got for this name through this pq.com site. You'll notice in the slide, you'll see that the top one is purple and the bottom one is purple. That's just me going through. I click on the first link. No, this isn't the person I'm looking for. I click on the second link. It kind of takes me to another public area, right? Well, what do I have now? Okay, guess what? I now have 2 independent sources that have a picture of somebody, the same picture of this guy named Neil Lawson. So we're kind of seeing a trend here that, look, this is probably the Neil Lawson that I'm looking for based on all this research. So the next slide, moving forward, let's say you have a phone number. That's my phone number I used as an example. You can go to Yahoo People Search and enter a phone number here. And next to the next slide, when you enter that, it gives you some information about this phone number, such as you'll notice here, there's a couple things here. This is if you're looking for somebody, say you want to serve a subpoena on them, or you want to try to get phone records. Note that it says the current telephone company is Verizon Wireless. You also notice it says that there's a original telephone company, T-Mobile, right? Well, we know T-Mobile is out of business. However, let's say that was AT&T, for example. Now, it doesn't tell you here when that number was ported, right? So keep that in mind. You may want to also look at AT&T for these types of business records. And then it gives you kind of an estimated city here. It says Yorba Linda. Yeah, that's where I live, but you won't find my address. Okay, this next slide, again, this is every social media site in the world here, okay? No, I'm just kidding. But isn't that a lot? Isn't that crazy? How many different social media sites there are out there? So if you have a screen name, you're researching somebody for one of your cases, and you have a screen name. I don't know their name, but I know their screen name. In this case, it's a really poor example because the name I used was insert name here. And as you can see, that name is taken on a lot of social media sites. So everything that comes back, it comes back and it's X'd out if it's taken, and then it's check marked if it says it's available. By the way, if any of you want to use it, it's still available on Facebook. Okay? At least according to this site. Now, the reason this is valuable is Gordon and Brian gave an example earlier of somebody who was involved in an accident. They're going after millions of dollars of damages, etc. Well, what if this person has the same screen name on several different sites, and they're posting things about them that would assist you in your case? So this is a good reference. MySpace. This tool here, if you happen to have a case where you've identified somebody on MySpace and you want to see, okay, let's see who else these guys are connected to. The MySpace Visualizer tool is free, by the way, and it kind of lets you put together a graph or a map of people and their connections. Now again, this is tied to what this user isn't smart enough to make private. And believe it or not, a lot of people kind of go with default settings, and they may not necessarily really think about the implications of setting up the higher level of security. So in this slide, you can see that you kind of map all their users together, and you can go to different windows, and you can see the friends they're connected to, and you can see pictures that get posted, and you can see messages they exchange if all that's made available there. The next slide is a real-life example of this one. I was working on a case where there was a posting made on YouTube that involved a public official. And it was a videotaped deposition. How they got it, who knows. But they took the posting and they modified it to add their own commentary and their own graphics, etc. So as you can imagine, it didn't look good for this official, right? So they wanted to know, well, hey, who did this? So YouTube Visualizer is very similar to the MySpace concept in that you can look who's friends, who's subscribers, subscriptions, when was joined, login times, different things like that, where you can start putting kind of a link together to identify a real person as opposed to just somebody anonymous on the internet. Again, this one is free as well. There's another one called Facebook Visualizer. Unfortunately, that's only available to law enforcement as of this time. However, in regards to Facebook, and again, if you're researching somebody who's not one of your clients, then you have to go through the publicly available sites and information that you can obtain. However, if you're in a litigation, you have a client, they use Facebook, and they've posted things on Facebook that are business related, and they've represented that to you. There's everything's on the above board. There is a Facebook export option that was recently added to Facebook. All right, the next slide has to do with, and I'll briefly touch on this because it sounds like a lot of you aren't really doing the research approach, but even from the collection approach, a little bit of soapbox here is note-taking and documentation is the key to your success for searching and collection. Sample research and collection forms, which I'm including, and if you want the slide, no problem, we'll give it to you. But the sample research and documentation, date and time of your research. So you did your research on a certain date and time, right? But you may not collect it that day. Now, it's a good idea when you're talking about social media to collect it as soon as humanly possible after you find that nugget that you want. It's just like a website. It can go down like that, right? So date and time of your research, what's the criteria you use? For example, if you're out searching, like I showed you earlier, I was on all kinds of different sites, right? Here, I was finding needle loss in here, and I was researching phone numbers there. You got to document all that. If it can be replicated, trust me, it will be introduced. As long as you do it in a manner that can be replicated by anybody doing it on the other side, it's good. Results. What were the results? The type of data collected. Type of data collected meaning, like, was it a web page? Was it a phone number database entry that I found? You know, what was the data that I collected? The method of collection. There are many different ways to collect data. If by chance you collect it on a different date, you want to note that. And then finishing up, this is kind of small, but it's kind of a sample, just a research checklist. Again, if you want it, if you're doing this for your company or you're doing this for your law firm, it's just kind of a hey, here's how to get. It's a starter template, I guess you could say, for those of you who may not have ever done any research like this. And then the last slide is actually a data collection form. For those of you that have been involved in traditional eDiscovery and collections, you know there's forms that you use. It documents the date, the time, the computer serial number, the hard drive you take out, right, all that stuff. And that's what you use. This is the type of form that you can use for social media research and collection, or other data collection through means.
So please join me in thanking the panel.